Good evening and welcome to the Penn State Landscape Architecture Department's Bracken Fellow Lecture with our guest and 2021 Bracken Fellow, Laurie Olin. I'm Alex Spangler, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture. I'm grateful to have Laurie here. I'm happy to sort of be meeting him in person. I can sort of claim to have worked on a project with Laurie before because for a couple of years off and on, I helped with editing this book that Michael van Valkenburg wrote, Designing a Garden. And Laurie contributed an essay to that book when I was asked to look over it. This was kind of 20 or 30 drafts into the main text. I was just completely floored. I had no edits to make because it was just poetry. It was great. And but it was a kind of artfulness that was so clearly grounded in such a deep knowledge and curiosity about the world. And I think of that as a really good analogy for what Laurie Olin brings to our field. So it's exciting to welcome someone of Laurie Olin's stature with his body of work and experience. But what I think makes him such a great choice for a Bracken Fellow is that he's an excellent communicator of all the things that are meaningful to our field. He's someone who would have a lot to talk about with the most advanced scholars and practitioners here at Stuckeman, but also I think with a first year BLA student just finding their footing in the world of design, because that comes from his many years of teaching. I really wish, and he just said the same, that we could welcome him into our studios, but we're lucky to have him here. So I just want to thank the department and college leaders who make this program possible. Thanks to Liza Pennypacker, former head of the Department of Landscape Architecture, as we were putting this together. Andy Cole, interim head of Landscape Architecture. Patricia Cooker, interim director of Stuckeman School. And Stephen Carpenter, dean of the College of Arts and Architecture. Thanks to Pam Wirtz and the marketing communication staff at Stuckeman School and our partners at WPSU for enabling this online lecture format, turning it into something a little more satisfying than just the Zoom screens that we all look at all the time. Thanks to David Goldberg, Assistant Professor, Landscape Architecture, for additional technical support. And finally, I want to thank my friend and former coworker, Chris Maurer, for helping to make this connection with Laurie. He's a graduate of our program and a landscape architect at Olin Studio. And I think it's a great confirmation of what we do here, that our students go on to find a home in such places, and that our connections to the larger world of landscape architecture, which is also a small world, remain vibrant and strong. So I am now going to introduce Landscape Architecture Department Head, Andy Cole.
Hi, I'm Andy Cole. I'm the interim department head for landscape architecture. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the lecture series, what it means for the Bracken Lecture Series and the Bracken Fellow. The Bracken Lecture Series is an annual lecture series made possible by the generous gift of Dr. John R. Bracken, who was head of Penn State Landscape Architecture from the 1920s to the 1950s. The series began in 1982, bringing exciting professionals to our department each year to enrich the experience of our students. The Bracken Committee solicits ideas for participants in the Bracken series from both students and faculty. Among our Bracken speakers each year is the Bracken Fellow, chosen as an individual of particularly high renown. Bracken Fellowship is the highest honor our department bestows, and it comes with the gift of the Bracken Medal, designed by internationally renowned metal sculptor and Penn State professor, John Cook. The face of the medal depicts the corona of the mountain laurel, the Pennsylvania state flower. The obverse side shows the demigoddess Daphne, her head surrounded by laurel leaves. As the legend goes, Daphne was terrified by Apollo's amorous pursuits and begged her father, the god Peneus, to protect her. To do so, the father transformed his daughter into a laurel tree. Laurie Olin, with this medal, you join many illustrious Bracken Fellows, from Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe to Ian McHarg, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, Ann Spurn, Jack Dangerman, and many more. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present you with this honor. I now pass this to Alyssa.
Thank you, Andy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alyssa. I'm a third-year BLA student and Communication Director for the Landscape Architecture Student Society at Penn State. And I am pleased to introduce you Laurie Olin. Laurie is a distinguished teacher, author, and one of the most renowned landscape architects practicing today. From vision to realization, he has guided many of Olin's signature projects, including the Washington Monument Ground in Washington, D.C., to Bryant Park in New York City, and the Getty Center in Los Angeles. His recent projects include the award-winning Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia and Apple Park in Cupertino. Laurie studied civil engineering at the University of Alaska and architecture at the University of Washington. He is currently an emeritus professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania and former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard University. Laurie is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and a recipient of the 2012 National Medal of Arts, the Vincent Scully Prize from National Building Museum. So please help me welcome Laurie Olin to Penn State. Back to you, Alec.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I just want to mention one quick technical thing. For those of you watching the lecture, you are free to type in questions at any point during the lecture. I'll moderate them by reading them off to our guest after the lecture has concluded. And without any more from us, I'd like to pass it to Laurie. Thanks a lot for being here.
Well, hi, thank you. Wow, I'm flattered and honored to receive this award, and it's a delight to be here. And good evening. Tonight, I'm going to reflect upon something that's been on my mind for quite a time. Actually, as you probably know, let me find the way to do this. What am I doing? Doing something wrong? There we go. Okay, I'm cooking. As you probably know, I've been interested in history and have done a lot of research and written on various topics relating to different places, periods, and things from classical antiquity right through private and public realms, contemporary urban situation, and that sort of thing. And a large number of the talks I've given, you may be familiar with, have devoted themselves to the craft and the making of landscape architecture and issues about form and meaning and expression regarding the art of landscape design, as well as notions about place, regionality, and identity. A selection of these are going to be published later this fall, which you see here, but I'm not going to focus on those. I'm going to focus on something a bit different tonight. An ongoing interest ever since I left Alaska as a young architecture student in college has been cities. And early on, I began to think of them as a most interesting form of landscape. They were dynamic and vital like forests. They're great living communities of interacting parts. But somehow I had an ecological view that they're not separate from nature. They're actually part of it. And just as we're part of nature, we're in it all the time wherever we are. And so looking at early forms of community and the seeds of urban life, you'll notice there are several things. The distinction between public and private space right away. The majority of built structures throughout time are domestic dwellings with storage and workspaces. There's also common areas for circulation, some of which are large enough for assembly and ceremony, whether they're secular or religious. And so these two examples you see here are, the top one is a Chaco Canyon here in the Southwest, and the other one is a sub-Saharan African village. But if we go forward, ideas concerning urbanity and methods for its layout and disposition became highly developed in classical antiquity. This is a plan of the Ionian city of Miletus from the Periclean period that was developed by Hippodamus. In the center, you can see major public spaces, the market and the government center and the religious facilities, with what we've come to refer as the overall pattern as a grid of the streets and the paths, some of which are stairs. Well, in addition to fundamental central community spaces like the one you see on the right from the ancient city of Ansidonia near Rome, you see there's government, there's markets, there's religion are all gathered around the space. And there's another fundamental aspect of the history of urban space, and that is streets. many people, especially architects and journalists who write about urban affairs and design, they tend to think of cities as shown in that upper sketch on the left of mine. It's as a collection of buildings, a group of important objects where gaps are seen as missing buildings and space between buildings. Most landscape architects and some planners, however, see the city also as a network of channels of circulatory spaces that create places and addresses for uses and activities. They see the connectivity forming a network as shown in that lower sketch. Such organization of urban life and facilities continued, but with interruptions and great elaboration from classical antiquity through the medieval times, right on into the Renaissance, and through the Enlightenment up until the industrial era of the late 18th century. These were sites for religious and civic festivals, for cattle markets, for executions, all manner of things, until there was a series of revolutions at the end of the 18th century that were social, political, technological, and economic that changed things dramatically. Here's Philadelphia at the end of the 18th century with its dense urban population. For example, it was the second largest English-speaking city in the world after London at the time, but it was a product of rationalist planning and design. The plan, produced near the end of the 17th century by William Penn's Green Country Town, was produced and laid out by Thomas Home, who'd been the chief military engineer under Cromwell during the Protestant Commonwealth in Britain, and shows a great familiarity with one of the proposals for the reconstruction of London after the Great Fire, and in turn, its own precedent, that was Palma Nova by Vincenzo Scamozzi from the late 16th century. It's a Hippodamian grid of streets with a series of open squares that are distributed equally to the different parts of the town. And there's one principal central square where in the early years of the 18th century, the main pumping facility for a municipal water system designed by Benjamin Latrobe was installed. In that northwestern one is Logan Square, which is shown in a photo from a century later. Well, as the 19th century began, cities in Europe and America expanded suddenly and densely as one industry after another took off, and people in droves left their farms and small communities around the world for work in the factories and in the cities. This is a picture of New York around 1850 as it suddenly expanded and began sprawling up the island of Manhattan and across the estuaries of the great rivers. And to appreciate and imagine the transformation and the shock of this world, as the opening of L.P. Hartley's wonderful novel, The Go-Betweens, has it quite brightly, the past is another country. They do things differently there. Cities had become a dynamic and turbulent country in the 19th century. Industry and the economy were expanding rapidly. Immigrants were pouring into America from Europe and Asia. And the work was difficult, it was long, it was hard, it was dangerous. Cities were crowded and dirty, often unhealthy. They were racked with social inequality and conflict, disease, and danger. But it was also a time of the rise of the middle class and an enormous consumer products market with the machine tool goods replacing handcrafts. A vast number of people crowded into cities and their public spaces, some of which in older capitals such as Paris and London had formerly been private enclaves of rulers and upper class mobility, as we see depicted here in this superb painting of the new demi-monde crowd of the Tuileries by Edouard Monet. A great number of the early paintings of Claude Monet present views of this new mercantile and consumer society at their leisure in a series of parks quickly built along with a network of new arterials and boulevards through the historic fabric of Paris between 1848 and 1860 that were designed, engineered, and constructed by an extensive bureaucracy under the control of Adolphe Alphand and Baron Haussmann. By now, we're all pretty familiar with the story of the path-breaking career and the creation of Central Park in New York and the subsequent work of Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. In part, he was inspired by contemporary European examples, especially a new purpose-built park called Birkenhead Park in Manchester, England, we know. This is where Olmsted saw people of different social classes at their leisure together in the open air of a landscape park. So in addition to these great parks and estates and campuses that he ended up designing, of really great importance was also the equal development by his firm of networks and systems of movement and open spaces threading through and uniting entire urban regions, as in these examples of the first park system in the nation that you see on the right here, which was in Buffalo, New York, done in 1876. And on the Fenway and the Muddy River project in Boston of 1875. Central Park, seen in the upper two photos, may in fact be the greatest single work of American art. Certainly, Manhattan would be uninhabitable without it. It was followed a few years later with its grand, equal, and nearly opposite sibling Prospect Park in Brooklyn, seen in that lower image. These vast and radical works of landscape construction changed their respective cities and launched a new profession in America, as you know. Well, how was it that Olmsted, this singular individual, was capable of such a triumph of imagination, not to mention his logistical and managerial expertise? The answer is that few individuals have been so prepared intellectually or practically. Frederick Olmsted had a remarkable 40-year career prior to taking on the management of the construction of the work for Central Park. And then with Vaux producing its final design and realization, and then 40 years of practice after that. This is a gallery of only a few of the contemporaries and personalities from what was Olmsted's milieu. Following his youthful study and travel as a seaman to Asia, and then there was a long period where he was a writer, a correspondent, a farmer, an editor, a publisher, and an abolitionist. This group may give a sense of the heady mix of intellects and personalities with whom he corresponded, a number of whom he actually met. He published, he worked, he edited, he socialized with several of these people. From the upper left, there's Ralph Waldo Emerson, Abraham Lincoln, of course, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass, Charles Darwin, you can't see under my portrait, but that's H.H. Richardson. Then on the next row down, we have, of course, Karl Marx, we have Frederick Engels, we have Thomas Carlyle, and Charles Darwin. And then the bottom row, there's Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Horace Greeley, Margaret Fuller, Charles Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Olmsted was involved in Putnam's Monthly, in The Nation, in the National New York Daily Times, the Garden and Forest. He produced articles and books on his travels in England and the antebellum South, and he was a correspondent with Andrew Jackson Downing prior to his death, when Vaux was still working with him. Olmsted was uniquely suited to think about issues involving cities and society, and he had a great concern for public health and democracy. He was clear about his thoughts and his purposes, and he wrote frequently about the need for people to partake of the outdoors and fresh air in the company of others. And because they no longer had easy access to the country and the woods, to farms, fields, and forests, to rivers and lakes, then he felt he had to bring such aspects of nature, they should be brought into the cities to make them healthy places of endeavor and of social discourse. So while living and working as an architect myself, as I was young in New York in the 1960s, I was deeply impressed by the work of Olmsted and Vaux, and I scrutinized their work assiduously. I also was interested in his writing and in his thought, which seemed to address issues of the day regarding society more than the design that I was working on for individual buildings. Well, I dropped out of architecture and spent the next several years painting, drawing, traveling, and reading, as much in ecology and history as in poetry and fiction. And I moved back to the West Coast. By 1969, I had a studio in what had been the Globe Hotel on Skid Road in Seattle, and I became involved in an effort to save the historic Pike Place market, a battle with the city that led to protests, lawsuits, hearings, and a referendum election. And as vice president of Friends of the Market, I performed the field work and helped fill out the paperwork to get it to the National Register of Historic Places. It was exhausting, but successful. At the same time, I spent time on the streets with the residents of Skid Row, and I ended up writing and publishing a study about the people in their community, something of an anti-urban planning tract it turned out to be. Soon after, I managed to depart for Europe on a couple of fellowships that allowed me to live and study on my own in Italy and England for 2 years. I'd made it clear in the proposals that I was intent on looking at the public life in some of the cities there, because I had a belief that it wasn't just a collection of famous buildings and monuments that made them such successful social environments for so many disparate people for so many centuries. It had to do something with their public spaces, their streets, the parks, and the ordinary background matrix of architecture and commerce that were undoubtedly part of the reason I felt. So I spent, since then, Many days over the years, I've been walking the streets, the parks, the plazas, and the squares of Paris, of London, of Rome, of Barcelona, as well as the great cities of the US, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, looking and thinking about their uses and their design. These two particular sketches are of one of my favorite parks, the Luxembourg Gardens, which is quite admirable because of its remarkable simplicity, its flexibility, and its durability, accommodating as it does large numbers of people, diverse activities, concerts, play spaces, fountains, cafes, a puppet theater, greenhouses with ample room to walk, jog, sit, sunbathe, doze, read, or socialize with family and friends. So on my return to America, I ended up teaching in the Department of Landscape Architecture at Penn, known for its emerging position in the study and practice of ecological planning and design under Ian McHarg, where he and most of my colleagues were trying to develop methods to deal with the mess our nation was making of its cities and its landscape. They were trying to produce a rational way of doing regional planning. I was very sympathetic, but not particularly suited emotionally or professionally to work on such a problem, while knowing how important it was. I was really more interested in the center of our cities. I was not a fan of a generation of planners who had come to the conclusion that the central city was passé, especially Mel Weber, who argued that contemporary transportation and communication devices would render the need for traditional centralization for community obsolete, and that location proximity would no longer matter. Cities were being hollowed out from coast to coast. Hundreds of millions now lived and moved about in the suburbs. That's Lower Manhattan on the lower left, adjacent to the World Trade Center in 1976. It didn't matter really what I thought of the suburbs, whether I liked them or not. It was totally immaterial. Whether they were wasteful of human and capital resources or not, that was very much a fact. And with the advent of computers, the need to be together in the minds of many seemed less and less, except for school athletics or religious gatherings and that sort of thing. Communities seem to be withering under capitalism and democracy. Ironically, in the opposite, it was sort of what Marx had hoped the state would evaporate under communism. I thought it was all a very wicked problem. Well, in 1976, with Robert Hanna, a colleague from Penn, I opened an office and turned my attention to the center of the largest city nearby, embarking on what must be considered experiments, a series of experiments in landscape architecture and central place identity. Here's Bryant Park down there in the bottom of that picture, our initial project of this nature. It's in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by millions of square feet of office and residential and manufacturing space. Well, the parts of Bryant Park are very elementary. They're trees, flowers, gravel, lawn, some railings, lights, places to sit. They're both fixed and movable. There's kiosks for refreshments, there's 2 cafes, and there's an amplitude and generosity in their distribution and their arrangement despite the size of the park. Bryant Park seems big, but it's really only 2 blocks wide in its narrow dimension and 6 blocks. I mean, it's only 6 acres in area. But as you just saw, it's tiny in the overall scheme of things in Manhattan. It's been a colossal success, much written about and debated, of course, praised for some because of its social behavior aspects that Holly White and I had both focused upon in the same years, principally the ability of individuals to control their personal environment simply by moving chairs, moving the furniture around, while they attend to more social decorum of the larger group and behavior. The rescue and the redesign of Bryant Park in Midtown Manhattan clearly, however, has as much to do with the remarkable management, maintenance, and programming of the park as it has to do with the physical design, which, although simple and clear in its elements, is extremely subtle. Here one sees visitors reading a schedule of events, the audience, and also an audience for a summer jazz concert. And down on the left, you can see the New Yorker magazine graphics from their events about this week in town, indicating that On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando was free Monday night movie in Bryant Park. Well, at the same time as this project, Bob and I embarked on a series of several planning and design projects for entire urban districts of former industrial land that was adjacent to urban centers. Battery Park City Master Plan done in collaboration with Alex Cooper from 1979 on the left, and in the center there. On a landfill in the Hudson River, it showed our concern for a purposeful set of interlinked streets and park spaces. the most important of which is the continuous mile-long waterfront esplanade. Well, later at Mission Bay in San Francisco, in collaboration with Bill Fain, beginning in 1995, we developed a plan. Here we go. We developed a plan with continuously linked public spaces, also with, again, access to the water's edge and internal shared focal spaces. While there's no horse-drawn carriages at Battery Park City, the motives and many of the activities are very little different from those of Olmsted parks in New York, both at the turn of the century and now. Leisure, relaxation, sunbathing, strolling, reading, eating, playing, partaking in sensual pleasures of natural elements, and enjoying the company of family and friends while sharing space with other citizens and strangers. Our office has experimented with such fundamental design and planning at several scales. This is Herman Park in Texas, which, like Bryant Park, was a wreck when we began work. The population of the city had largely abandoned it. But working for a nonprofit friends group, as we had at Bryant Park, we worked on it off and on for over a decade, producing a number of projects for over a dozen other firms, including not just ourselves. Again, the underlying concept was that of an open park, well-made with basic amenities. People have returned in flocks. It is once again attractive, it's safe, it's heavily visited and used, it's well managed in a public-private partnership. While the physical design and the construction of many of the facilities and infrastructure was actually complex, time-consuming, costing large sums of money, it was all accomplished. And while I'm highly skeptical about many of these supposed universal truths, I do know that what the places that we make, especially in the public realm, and actually an awful lot of what we call private, whether it's an institution or some commercial spaces, are in another way blatantly public. What we make affects the quality of innumerable lives. For instance, as here in these pictures, you can see the National Gallery of Art Sculpture Garden between Constitution Avenue and the National Mall. And while it has a large complement of important sculpture, it's also designed for different activities in different seasons. And like other successful public spaces, looks as good when it's empty as it is when it is full of groups. Here, it is nearly overwhelmed by a convivial crowd, mostly composed of young office workers from federal and private office buildings nearby on a Friday night in the summer when there are regularly scheduled jazz concerts. For all the beguiling charms of digital social media, the internet, and its visual cornucopia, humans are as gregarious as any of our relatives, the primates and the great apes. We truly do love to be together. In 2006, we were engaged in a multi-year project here in Philadelphia by the Center City District, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My partners, Susan Weiler and Richard Rourke, worked with a team of others to produce a new design for the front plaza and the revitalized subway terminal at our City Hall on Market Street, a complex piece of engineering and urban design. Although we work with computers for more than a decade by then, and we're a decade into the ubiquitous use of smartphones and social media, I began to think that maybe my stubborn skepticism regarding Mel Weber and the planning theoreticians and philosophers who felt so strongly that traditional spatially centered communities and cities were a thing of the past, that the idea of civic space was passé, when a place could function quietly as both a local hangout and play space, or could be turned into a gathering spot for an entire city around something of shared interest, concern, or great excitement, as seen here, after we'd just won a pennant finally with one of our teams. Well, here's a different example. Simon and Helen Director Park also began that very same year of 2006. In fact, it's a very small square, or really a piazza. Well, it has trees, and all the rain that falls on the streets, plaza, and roofs is caught, treated on-site, planters, and used. It's paved from the face of one building across the park and across the street to another, and it's not a conventionally soft park. There's a tall shelter for the frequent rain, a fountain, a small cafe. And it's built over a 6-story below-grade parking garage in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon. Well, unlike Dilworth or Bryant Park, it's as I say, tiny. Measures only 200 feet by 100 feet, not counting sidewalks and streets, both of all of which I incorporated into the expanded paved surface for a couple of reasons. One was to make drivers and cars moving through it realize that they were in an area that privileges pedestrians over vehicles, and the other was to make the park feel less constrained and to have it stretch from building to building across the block. Also, it was to allow for maximum pedestrian use, when by simply closing the streets for a day, the piazza expands for events such as this, when the community came out to watch together the US women's soccer team playing in the World Cup. Well, the first summer after it was completed, we discovered that daycare groups from distant neighborhoods were bringing their kids here for half a day at a time. In part, it was a comment upon the widespread need for more play facilities throughout the city, but also that it was just fine to bring kids downtown to a place where workers, shoppers, teenagers, and other strangers were hanging out. I was delighted by the mix of age groups that are found consistently in this park. Journalists and landscape architecture design jurors who looked at the park were mildly friendly, but they referred to it as stark and were somewhat puzzled that it seems to work and that it's okay. Partly, I suspect, from it unfortunately being called a park and not possessing lawn and bounteous planting. They don't seem to notice that it's bounded by trees, which if my colleagues and I have gotten our homework right, will continue to grow for many years until they're quite large and have a significant presence in this small place. There's also a bosque in a small corner space with a chessboard that's composed of yellowwoods, a lovely tree from the Appalachians. It was discovered by John Bartram that will surprise people when the long pendulous racemes of white blossoms hang down in the spring, more or less heavily every other year. While all the parts of this park are perfectly ordinary, the ensemble is not. It has been enormously popular. And despite its small size and lack of lawn, it attracts a wide diversity of people of all ages and economic strata throughout the day and into the night. A couple of years after it opened, the park department took counts of users every day throughout the summer. Between the hours of noon and 7 p.m., there were typically more than 100 people per hour using this small space. In August, an average of over 2,000 people were counted in this small piazza between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Old people, mothers with prams and children, office workers, shoppers, all find their way to it, and they hang out. While one must be wary of such methods in judging quality, the high body counts from Vietnam are only one of the most dramatic proofs that quantitative measurement does not equate with qualitative success. It should make us eternally skeptical of such evaluations. Still, people were voting with their feet. Well, while Portland and its citizens have been demonized by our federal government and the media this past summer, I can assure you that they are a marvelous bunch of freedom-loving people in a community long committed to a democratic government, an open, tolerant, and pluralist society. Here are a number of them socializing on a pleasant summer night in the heart of their city. In addition to such fundamental felicity or sociability, I believe another role of civic spaces in the heart of our cities is to provide a locus, a place for the expression of our memories and our ideas, to frame our rituals and our common aspirations. The plan we developed for the reconstruction of Independence Mall in Philadelphia, which took over 7 years to create, is just such a place. For a number of neighbors, office workers, and the local institutions, it functions at all seasons as a local neighborhood park and is partly designed and furnished for such purpose. It also functions as a global and national tourist venue and is seen here as a regional gathering place for important civic events such as national elections, papal visits, and huge celebrations. With all that said, however, in recent years, I began worrying if my views of community and civics were no longer valid in the face of global urban trends. Was I clinging to a romantic, even heaven help me, nostalgic idea of community? Well, looking at these three cities, and I could quiz you on which ones they are: Shanghai, Hong Kong, is that Dallas, is that London, New York, Beijing? Unless you travel a lot, it's a bit hard to tell. But my point is, where and what would a central place or even a set of centers in important civic spaces be or mean here? Seen from this perspective, they are either abstractions, these things you're looking at, these images, they're either abstractions or they are giant anthills. Well, maybe I began to worry, maybe Mel Weber was right after all, or instead of community without propinquity, we have achieved propinquity without community. As long ago as 1973, Manfredo Tafori had written, "Modern urbanism, inasmuch as it is a utopian attempt to preserve a form for the city, or rather to preserve a principle of form within the dynamics of urban structures, has not been able to realize its models." While a lot of older suburban residents began moving back to the urban centers in all parts of the nation about a decade ago, and many millennials have recently moved into urban communities and neighborhoods in large cities on both the East and the West Coast, the continued growth and sprawl of communities around and beyond these centers has continued. As a number of older cities and towns across the country are hollowed out, as we now know, with the attendant social, economic, and political turmoil and damage that any sentient being in the country must be aware of, I thought about how little of what I do as a landscape architect addresses any of this. How much of the country my profession really has no effect upon. It was worrying. And then nearly all of one's anxieties and sense of impending doom seemed to come together in a big wave, within a matter of a few years. Global climate change had been on the radar since the late 1970s, not global warming. That's just a piece of it. There's also sea level rise and drought and the wilder storm perturbation, which means more and more fiercer storms and cold spells and precipitation and fires and floods. And then the global pandemic happened and knocked every country in the world off its game. And despite our recent follies, at least we don't have Brexit on top of it. But then there was an outbreak of police murders of Black people, and nationwide protests met with police riots and inevitable chaos that responded in cities across the country, only followed by the most chaotic and disturbing election since the Vietnam War, which is still unwinding in ways none of us can quite foresee. So I've been reflecting a bit about this topic, as many of you have, but in my case, about civic space, about public plazas and parks. And I began thinking back to the Arab Spring. Well, it'd be foolish to say that such spaces and needs are relics of history, as these photos taken in Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011 demonstrate. A less dramatic but equally communal event took place at the Center Square in Philadelphia in 2008 when the Phillies won the World Series. When events stimulate a significant portion of the society, there is this urge to assemble in public at the heart of the polis. It's very powerful. So from Tiananmen Square to the mall in Washington, D.C., from the Vietnam and civil rights gatherings of the 1960s to recent events, from peaceful to violent, the move to the center where power and community is manifest in a place is powerful. Here's Philadelphia this past November, with crowds at the mall at Independence National Historic Park and in the streets around the convention center where votes are being counted and the nation and the world are watching. Both Thomas Jefferson and Alexis de Tocqueville, they had great concerns about our experiment in democracy, namely the ambivalent situation of the balance between concern and the balance they had about privilege and the concern about potential conflict between the individual and the group, between rights and obligations. There was a fear of tyranny of the majority, or conversely, a tyranny of the minority. This unresolved contradiction layered upon the structural inequalities of slavery, of property ownership, and of capital, the strong versus the weak, all things that we are all now trying to work through. My point is, this is where it's taking place. The urge to reclaim the streets, the arteries, the connective elements for citizens from vehicles and ever increasing and burdensome traffic for pedestrians within the collective urban realm has been manifest in major cities around the globe in the past 2 decades. On the left, you see the transformation of an urban expressway on the right bank of the Seine in Paris to become an esplanade and an urban beach called the Paris Plage. Or think of the preservation and then astounding transformation of an elevated rail freight line in the former meatpacking district in Manhattan in New York, inspired by the earlier Promenade Plantée, as it's known in Paris. This is not some brief fad, but an assertion of something fundamental, which is that the city is here to support the lives and the well-beings of its inhabitants. Although many of our streets in the heart of our cities are far too important to leave in control of traffic engineers, they aren't really enough or an adequate answer to certain needs. I designed this park that you see specifically for such situations which need symbolic locations adequate to such needs. I pushed the public buildings to one side and trees and shady alcoves to the other, with the Constitution Center and Independence Hall as bookends, framing an open center shaped and sized for crowds and events of various sizes. Setting aside questions about centrality, its need or its character, there are also, or still, public parks. Those purpose-designed places for people to step out and into while still in the city. These are places to find fresh air, to be able to look about and see where one is. Who else is there? Strangers and neighbors. While they're artificial constructions, parks also present nature and its elements, the sun and the sky, breezes and the weather, seasons, and community. Here at Wagner Park, I purposely lifted the back of the park so that it would gradually step down toward the water, and one would step into the great space of the Hudson River to look around. There's never a sense of being trapped or uncertain who else is in the park and where they are. It's open to the world and society. This is Schuylkill River Park, here in the very middle of Philadelphia on a summer night prior to the pandemic. There's something I read in my last year in architecture school that has stayed with me ever since, which J.B. Jackson said in an essay entitled The Imitation of Nature, which, among other things, clearly states why that is both a bad idea and it's also impossible, which was that a city, and I'm quoting, must be a just and efficient social institution. It must be biologically wholesome habitat, and it must be a continuously satisfying aesthetic sensory experience. Well, the current pandemic has been for all of us it's been all those terrible things that have been said about it. But one of the most interesting things has been the rediscovery of the public realm. The overwhelming return and use of parks and nature as millions of people cooped up and kept apart for months sought relief, solace, and a place to be together safely. These photos could have been taken in almost any American city last summer. They happen to be in Fairmount Park and Schuylkill River Parks here in Philadelphia. One person and one writer after another commented upon the long and lovely spring we had last year, as though there had never been one before. But of course, it was because they weren't outside paying attention before. And they'd spent the last few years looking at images of the world, virtual distractions on a screen, instead of looking at the real thing. It seems more and more clear that we must once again learn to see things with the eyes of a child, as I set out to do with these fountains in Los Angeles and Portland. These are basins that are like a beach with no coping. The water simply moves up and down. It splashes, it runs downhill, it puddles and makes ponds. One can simply walk in and out of it or through and around it. There is no danger, but considerable interest from this ordinary thing. It was a century ago that Ezra Pound, one of the greatest writers in modern literature, said, "Make it new." But to do it, we must know what it is. It is life, the world itself, all the ordinary stuff, especially the welter of nature and its situations, and even the accumulated apparatus, the paraphernalia, and the confusion of civilization. So who are we designing for? Who is the client? Who is the audience? It's people, our fellow citizens, men, women, and children, young and old, particularly that last pair, children and the elderly. They are never at the table or in the meetings and the design sessions. And despite community workshops and the rest, they are voiceless. I've found that if a public space works well for children and for elderly people, it'll probably work well for everyone else in between. Also, I found out long ago with the design of Bryant Park that if a place attracts and works well for the middle class, that people less wealthy or more so will be very happy to be there as well. And why not? When the offerings are fundamental earthly pleasures that stimulate us all, regardless of who we are. But that is about parks and streets, urban spaces, places. What about the big picture? Well, knowing what we now know, at the national and global level, we must all pitch in and work to reduce our contribution to global warming and bring our various governments under control of reason and the clear disasters facing us, not just as a nation, but as a species of life. And on the other hand, on the level of individual efforts as landscape architects and designers. So I decided to think carefully once more, back up and think about basic principles and proceed with some reflections. Let's clarify a bit and return to Central Park. The last census before the pandemic by the Central Park Conservancy determined that it had 40 million visitors a year, which is about 115,000 a day, more than all the professional sports attendances put together, seasonally. And there are more than 800 different species of plants and animals present in the park. We might describe the physiology and scientific facts a bit differently, but Olmsted understood something basic and got it right when he wrote in 1870, air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air to screen it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees and recently acted upon by sunlight. Well, these photos are of the construction of the Boston Fenway and of the result. The Central Park Conservancy has made a comprehensive inventory of the composition of the park and its uses, discovering some interesting things. One of which is that 85% of all park activity was passive. And even though a disproportionate amount of space is taken up by the central receiving basin for the Croton Aqueduct and pavements for roads and paths, the amount of woodland, despite appearances, it's not very great. The benefits of the park are inestimable in many ways, as they are beginning with the environmental cooling to decrease the heat island effect, carbon sequestering to start with. Then there's habitat supply, there's improving air quality, and so on and so on. It's a huge and beneficial resource in terms of human health, physical, psychological, emotional, and it also has had a major positive economic impact. The breakdown one summer day yielded more fine-grained data, revealing, among other things, that 89% of usage not only was for passive recreation of one sort or another, but that active recreation was less than a quarter of the usage, and only 10% of that was in team sports, despite the acreage devoted to ball fields, and it was far outnumbered by dog walkers and nature study. In an essay in 1870 explaining himself, Olmsted wrote, "We want a ground to which people may go after their day's work, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, feeling nothing of the bustle of the streets, where they shall in effect find the city put far away from them. Practically, what we want most is simple, broad, open space of clean greensward with sufficient play space and sufficient number of trees to supply a variety of light and shade. We want depth of wood enough about it, not only for comfort in hot weather, but to completely shut out the city from our landscapes." Ultimately, size does not matter. Size does matter, really matters. So does quantum. The landscape architect Dan Kiley once turned to me and said, "Proportion is everything." Well, that's true enough, Dan, but quantum is the central problem of our era. The number and sheer amount of things. Too much of anything is too much. Scale and balance are important. Diversity and quality are too. Our cities need a balance of spaces, big and little, hard and soft, active and calm, shady and sunny. Our public spaces need to respond to the character and to the needs of our population, which is quite diverse, and to our moment. And they need to be adequate in scale and extent to the problem. We need to be clear about this. We should not be on the defensive when it comes to urban space. Now, Los Angeles, there it is. Los Angeles is a very big and a very important city with millions and millions of people, and it has all the problems of large cities in America today. 5 years ago, Frank Gehry called and asked me to come out and talk with him about doing something with the LA River. I love Frank. We've worked together on things off and on for more than 20 years, but this seemed a bit crazy, but I went. In March of 2016, our offices began working closely. No, I don't mean 2016. What do I mean? 26. Back up. What is this? 2021? No, 2016. Yeah, that's right. March of 2016, our offices began working closely on a long-term plan for the Los Angeles River. We were joined by a large local engineering firm with a strong history of civil engineering and regional projects involving hydrology. In the course of the past 4 years, We've reviewed thousands of pages of historic and current planning documents, had a continuous series of meetings with county supervisors, public works staff, omnibus citizen steering committee, and representatives from 14 cities while working continuously on the nuts and bolts of a plan and its implementation. Now, a number of people for decades have tried to figure out what on earth to do with the LA River. Most of the time, it's pretty empty, but it becomes a very dangerous raging floodway several times a year because of monsoonal rains, which are likely to increase. My partners and I gave a design studio a few years back at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture, and we spent some time with the Corps of Engineers, various hydrologists, ecologists, local advocates for the natural restoration of a portion of it, local practitioners, government officials, only to conclude that it is a very large and a very difficult situation. In fact, it is a great example of a wicked problem, such as Horst Riddle and Mel Weber have described as a wicked problem. Namely, it's a problem whose social complexity means it has no determinable stopping point. Moreover, because of complex interdependencies, the effort to solve one aspect of a wicked problem may reveal or create other problems. It sure sounds familiar. Well, local plans and funding were developed several years ago to rebuild a whole portion of it to produce a soft bottom and a wildlife habitat. But a subsequent study of the Corps of Engineers has discovered that this project would severely increase the problem of flooding, cause a huge financial, political, and social upheaval. Despite good intentions and a lot of effort, working with pieces of the river is clearly not the solution. So our two offices began working on the problem quietly, talking to engineers and hydrologists, medical research folks, local governments, combing through data about the region, its natural history, and looking at all 51 miles of the river, its watershed, and the 14 cities that it flows through. We began our work with a lengthy data gathering and analysis phase lasting nearly 2 years, with ongoing input ever since. And putting such information together with other factors, we've produced a pollution burden map for Los Angeles County. The correlation with floodplains formerly used by the river and its tributaries is really pronounced. We divided the river into its natural geomorphological zones of reaches and bends, summarizing and synthesizing the data, and we found that only 2 portions of the river and its adjacent lands even meet the World Health Organization criteria for safe and healthy human dwelling. Not surprisingly, this has a strong correlation with the location and distribution of lower income communities, those in society with the least resources and the absolute most need. We plotted the incidence of asthma and type 2 diabetes, along with other diseases in Los Angeles County, and again found a clear correlation with the path of the river and its tributaries. Mapping this and other health data, and then totaling the cost to society of the 6 most common preventable diseases suggests that something needs to be done, and at the scale of the problem. One thing we do know is that proximity and access to parks has a strong proven positive effect upon public health for children and adults alike. Again, examination of Los Angeles County and the 14 cities that the LA River runs through shows an enormous absence of parks, especially in the areas of most need. Well, 3 weeks ago, we submitted a final draft plan to the County Board of Supervisors, who are now reviewing it with their public works staff. And it's subject to several months of public scrutiny and comment, along with a mandatory environmental impact assessment by others, after which we will inevitably be asked to make some changes and some adjustments, and it will then be approved and implementation will go forward. A little over a year ago, we arrived at a set of 9 shared and agreed goals, which had to do with flood safety, water management, water quality, its use, its storage, its supply, about habitat, ecosystem support, and social support, such as equity regarding housing and the homeless, in addition to community access to recreation, health, and cultural facilities. In the course of all of our research, meetings, and analysis, one obvious thought occurred. The river offers an opportunity for 51 miles of connected open space. But given the existing situation, how would one produce it? And what could it really turn out to be? This is where it should lead, but what is a realistic way in terms of funds and political will? How to start? Well, we ended up making a proposal for a range of a series of projects. Many are very small and extra small, spaced fairly regularly throughout the full length of the 51-mile corridor and communities along the river. Additionally, there was clearly a need for a number of medium large and extra large projects, again, based upon the scale and the diversity of the communities and their demonstrated need. Each one of the goals has a section with particular parts and strategies that are recommended for it. For instance, how to reproduce ecological connectivity working with resources alongside the river in appropriate and in key locations. One of the final tasks we really needed to do was to show what the probable content and outcome of various projects would and could be. What would it look like? As you see here, in a specific situation, both before, above, and after, below, depicting a large ensemble of these projects on, over, and alongside the juncture of the LA River with the Rio Honda at an important location in East LA and Southgate and Bell Gardens, adjacent to Cudahy and near Compton. A portion of this group of related projects is shown in this sketch on the left. It's intended to be a created wetland intended to capture and clean rainfall and runoff from the adjacent community and highway while providing riparian habitat. The pedestrian circulation here will function to connect several neighborhoods to the river corridor and across to a new cultural center on the other side of the river, which our combined team has recently begun schematic design on a separate contract that is being funded by the state, as well as and private funds, by the way, donations. So there will be all these educational programs in addition to the physical and social things that you see here. As with so much of the work we engage in, people will want to know, how does it feel? Do I like it? So we've had to make these feasible pre-designed decisions based upon our experience and the likely budgets and the implementations and a set of guidelines we laid down regarding the plant palettes and the materials and that sort of thing. At times such as this past year, we may think of our problems as somehow insurmountable. Well, this has been the view of many people, numerous times throughout history. But the Olmsteds, the father and his two sons, individually and as an office of professionals, believed that we could change things for the better through our thought and our effort, through careful planning and design. They agreed with a remark made a generation later by Lewis Mumford, who said, "Trend is not destiny." For a span of 100 years, they worked at the scale of the problem with that belief. Some of my peers think that this work is old-fashioned, while others derive great delight in the particularities of these marvelous designs. Once again, recently, I've tried to look very clear-eyed at it and to conclude that we must not lose sight of the fact that each of these places is part of a larger vision and an endeavor. Like them, we must take up the task of working at the real scale of our problems. Now, this doesn't mean that I've lost interest in issues of aesthetics and expression or concern for beauty, design, and form, for it's through such concerns as these very works that we create the important and meaningful projects and sites, that we build out the larger patterns. It's just that today I wanted to reflect on these other fundamentals. In conclusion, as President Obama wrote in A Promised Land, and I'm quoting, "In an interconnected world of global supply chains, instantaneous capital transfers, social media, transnational terrorist networks, climate change, mass migration, and ever-increasing complexities, we will learn to live together, cooperate with one another, and recognize the dignity of others, or we will perish." And so the world watches America, the only great power in history made up of people from every corner of the planet, comprising every race and faith and cultural practice, to see if our experiment with democracy can work, to see if we can actually live up to our creed. And I think that is what landscape architects have been trying to do since several centuries ago. That's what we do. Thank you very much. Stop sharing. I'm supposed to hit stop share. There we go. Ha. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm here.
There you are, Alex.
We're back, and imagine clapping as you've had to do the last few months.
Okay.
That was fantastic. I don't want to talk too much because I want to get right to our questions. I am going to try to give as much logic as I can to these and consolidate when I can.
Well, I'll try to be succinct for a change too.
Lots of good ones though, so we'll see how far we get. Yeah, they keep coming. So I just want to start with this one because it dovetails on the LA River. So while it's fresh,
good.
Katie asked, and I'm going to approve it so it shows up. I'm glad to see the 43 projects being proposed along the corridor based on community needs. When I first saw the current proposal, parentheses, building elevated parks over the river on concrete with the river remaining channelized underneath, I couldn't see how the expense was justified. Why not spend that money on street trees, neighborhood parks, infrastructure in those environmental justice communities? But it appears that the elevated park part of the project, which has garnered attention in the media, is only part of the overall plan.
Yeah, the answer is there are only a few of them. And there are key places where we desperately need land and we need to make real estate that it doesn't exist. Part of the whole idea was to have something for everyone where you first get people access to the river and then give them all 51 miles on both sides of the river as a continuous movement for pedestrians and bicycles. Once you do that, you've got 102 miles of connected city and citizens who then can begin to demand various things and decide why they want something in one place, not another. So what part of our idea was, and it's like this lightning rod, everybody like, oh, they're covering the river. Well, no, of course we can't afford to do it very often. And you can only do it in a few places where that's the only best thing you could do, and why not? There will be numerous bridges, of course, but we are also working on how to develop a series of programs inside the river. But of course, you can only go down in the river when it's safe, which is most of the time, but not all the time. And the minute you put something in the river, it gets swept away. We looked at we began trying to figure out how to make it all green and discovered that as soon as you do that, you spread the water out times, 4 times 7 times something else. You make the width of the thing, because the entire city is built in a floodplain. The river used to wander all over the place and it's flat as a board, pretty much, just sloping to the ocean. And so, and they channelized it and then built right up to it. And we'd have to tear down large chunks of the city in order to come up with real estate. So part of the idea was to find as much public owned land we could control and use these saddlebags to do things like wetlands and parks and that sort of stuff, but then find ways to connect communities. So I think there's only about 4 of those decks out of the 50 miles, in various locations. Okay. So I'm glad you were worried about it. It's the right thing to worry about. No, we're not that dumb, as you would imagine, hopefully. I mean, yeah, sure. We're not like Madrid, who covered the whole darn thing,
Yeah. So going down to the bottom of the list again,
Sure.
And I'm going to interpret this one a little bit. How relevant is it to highlight forms and organizations under contemporary contexts, for it may no longer strongly apply to beliefs, spirituality, and social class, or the focus changed to program, ecology, health, etc.? How do the forms and organizations inform diversity and inclusion and associated value under contemporary contexts? And I just read into that a question about form.
What's a
design
question about
and
traditional form and do they still have meaning? Some forms, I think, have lost all their meaning and it's been drained from them. There's no question about it. I mean, neoclassical forms, certainly, and a lot of things having to do with, shall I call it, Euclidean geometries. We don't build parks that look like belt buckles anymore, that sort of thing. But I think form, one can get sidetracked by thinking that it's interesting when it has nothing, it doesn't really do much. Whether a park has a zig or a zag, it's really more important if people can come in and sit together, or if they can get in the shade when it's hot, and if they can play comfortably. And for groups, people like to be together, but then they tend to want to kind of hang out with people of their own kind, but they don't mind being next to the other people or right among them. And so designing It's more having to figure out how to do a series of different territories that are interrelated and interdependent and will kind of hang together as a place for people. And how you do that formally is up to the individual and the handwriting. And so I was trying not to show personal handwriting today because I felt that was this person's question was, there's an awful lot of, it's part of the problem with contemporary architecture is it's become such a, so involved with the personality of the individual trying to express themselves through identifiable form. They're producing collectibles, but well, that's not really what design. A lot of our parks don't look alike at all. They're quite different depending on where we are and what the problems are and how big it is and who's it for. The deeper problem in that question is the one about a pluralist society of people who may not share some of the same values and ideas about pleasure or about safety or about comfort and that sort of thing, and how to produce places that are not just bland and neutral and characterless, but still will tolerate diversity and difference. That I think is a really good question, and I think it's what those involved in the trenches doing the work are dealing with on a daily basis of how to produce diversity and in environments that will allow for diversity of behavior. I think that's, and then if you try to find forms that are suitable for those decisions. That would be my answer. I hope that's not too evasive.
Endless question, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for that question. That was really good. And the next.
Well, let me just say one more thing.
Okay.
For quite a while, I noticed that students could not do a design without having a bunch of diagonals in it. They just could not do a design without sharp corners and diagonals, which really had nothing to do with whether it was a successful place or how you quite often were counterintuitive in terms of how one might want to walk or move. So one could say that there are fashions and everything, and unfortunately our field suffers from them from time to time in terms of forms. And I think the question was good about raising the fact that one mustn't be beguiled by sets of forms.
Great. There are a few questions that are pandemic related, so I'll try to mash them up into one. And I'll just read the first one. Since the pandemic, are there parts of these spaces that you've worked on that you've noticed are being utilized differently now than before? And then others were asking about, I think, if you have ideas on strategies for designing post-pandemic, or if that's changed your approach.
Well, I can't say that I've noticed. I mean, people go to the parks, and of course, for a while we all had the idea that oh, you don't have to have masks. I'm outdoors. I'm safe. Now we realize, no, you better put on a mask. You better stay trying to, yes, you're picnicking with your best friend or your family, but you want to keep your distance. And so people are using the parks, but thank God I've argued for long benches and said 8-foot benches are better than 6-foot benches for years, because people can sit at the two ends of them. Watching people, how they space themselves out has been one of the most interesting things. If they're paying attention, they usually do a pretty good job, but it means, as everyone would figure out, that you have less people per square foot in a place, and especially in linear situations. I've noticed a little bit of difference, and it's mostly about spacing one's self out. I've also noticed that everyone went to the greenest parks possible as soon as possible. That was very interesting, especially as spring came on. People, flocked to anything that is in bloom and started taking pictures like mad. That was one of the things I noticed, was that we really are attracted to, change and color and diversity, that sort of thing. And so if there was crowding, it would be around things like that. And that was, if there was hazard, it was that sort of thing. The other thing I noticed is that in Philadelphia, and it seems to be happening in other cities elsewhere, which I haven't been able to go visit, the taking over of streets by cafes so that people could continue to dine together. Our desire as Homo sapiens to dine together, eat and drink together, and watch other people eating and drinking while we're eating and drinking with our friends is enormous. And the impact socially on people of not being able to dine indoors or out until all the cafes figured out, oh, I can build these little cubicles and space them out and that sort of thing. So there are a whole bunch of streets in Philadelphia, and presumably I've seen photographs in New York and Denver and other places, but there's whole streets that are just all continuous wall-to-wall outdoor restaurants. It's like, maybe this will change America. We'll be more like Rome than ever. People sitting out like they're in Oslo in the middle of winter eating. So the behavior that I've noticed the most difference in has been in the insistence on finding a way to eat together, no matter what. I find that really interesting, because one of the things I've done in a lot of the parks is argued like hell to have cafes and toilets. And sure enough, here all these public spaces are cafes and they have toilets. It's very interesting. That's a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
Oh, big question, I think. Just reading up, Olmsted had such a keen understanding of the social and ecological challenges at the time, especially regarding issues of class and industrial pollution. If Olmsted were alive and practicing today, what do you think his biggest concerns would be? What kind of landscape?
Climate change. He'd be onto it. I mean, it's the biggest thing, isn't it? I mean, and his instinct was always to go for what's the biggest problem. Let's start working there, and I'll work my way down to the pieces. And I think that's kind of how we try to approach the river in Los Angeles. What's the biggest problem? And we said public health. All these people who have the least amount of money and have the worst health and are in the most trouble, and they are all in the same place along, there's like 25% of the population of California is within an hour's drive of the Los Angeles River. What could you do to help all those people? So I think Olmsted would be trying to work at the scale of the problem again and saying, well, pocket parks are nice and they're nice for your neighborhood, but that's not really the problem of the city. It's a bigger problem. And his genius for realizing that natural systems work their way through cities, whether you like it or not. How do you take advantage of those and turn those into the biggest amenities, the things that were causing the floods and the problems and the chaos and the sinkholes and all that stuff? Those are the places you could actually produce open space that was healthy and bring people into it. So I think his use of systems thinking would be something we could all learn from. We could learn from his logistical genius and his tactical approach to things. If people get hung up about the Victorian details, they should look at the strategies.
What is the main difference between the urban landscape of the US and Europe, in your opinion? And how does that impact people's lifestyles?
Well, it depends on where in the US you're talking about. In Los Angeles, we have a lot of private splendor and public squalor. In other cities, there's more. Well, let me put it this way. The cities in Europe are smaller, and they were dense. They were low-rise, high-density cities. And we've produced low-rise, low-density cities with high-rise, low-density in the downtowns in a strange way. And so part of it has to do with the distribution of people, the distribution of people in relationship to their work. That more people could walk to work or take short trips on some kind of form of transit. By dismantling the transit systems in America, which Detroit managed to do very successfully, because we had great distribution of traffic, transportation with all the trolleys and interurbans and subway surface lines. By dismantling that, they really made it hard for us to recreate that kind of low density or low rise, high density, walkable work-live relationship. And so some of the cities that are trying to reorganize themselves right now are doing it around that. They're doing it around where people live, colonizing residential areas, former industrial areas like in Brooklyn or in the northeast of Philadelphia up here, and in Lodo and Denver and places like that. And so one of the things I'd say is that it's not just that they're older or they're cuter or something like that. That's not it. It actually had to do with the relationship between life, work, live, eat, play, walk, commute, etc. That sort of thing. I think those are the biggest differences. And so that's part of why Mel Weber's idea about community without propinquity. Propinquity just means, next to each other, adjacency, being together. And he was saying, oh, you could have community, and it was even before smartphones and the internet. He believed that, that don't worry, you don't need to be together. Well, I think we proved that's rubbish in the last year. But the how to be together in terms of remodeling the physical infrastructure we have is really a very interesting question. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's some of the differences. Well, I'll say one more thing. And that is that when Olmsted's parks were built, they were built in an expanding economy, a giant expansion of the economy, and America was very rich. And then there was this cheap labor force that had all arrived from Asia and Europe by the hundreds of thousands. And so most of those great parks were built out on the edge of what was the developed area at the time. So they had enough room to build parks that were at the scale of what was going to come and surrounded them. Now we have developed cities, many of them without such facilities, without big parks. And how do you come back and overlay the parks at the scale that is needed of the population that exists? What are you going to tear down? What are you going to, can you put it on top? Can you overlay it? I was looking at a project out west in Cupertino where we ended up with 21 acres of park on top of connected roofs of buildings, just so that, because I said you can't build it next to town anymore, so why not just put it on top of town? and so we have to think of ways to do it, new ways. I'm
going to try to combine.
Sure.
Well, I'll ask one question.
You have a tough project here.
that has gentrification as part of it, and I'll let that count for the next question too, which mentions gentrification. But I think this was a really interesting way of phrasing this. You described the way people tend to prefer movable seating in public spaces because it gives them a sense of control. How might this sense of control play out for people at a larger scale, such as communities who are exposed to destructive processes like mining, deforestation, or at risk of gentrification?
That's a really good question. Well, control and the power over one's own destiny is clearly one of the big issues that philosophers have been dealing with since ancient Greece. The dilemmas, let's put it this way. I'll come to the mining and forestry in a second, but about the movable chairs. If you look at the work we've done, there's always a combination of fixed and movable. Fixed furniture has the problem of it's stiff and it's there and blah, blah, blah. But if a long bench or a wall or something, actually they shape and form spaces, and you can bring chairs up to them and against them. And so the cafe banquette, where you've got a fixed piece and then you've got the loose chairs, actually as a prototype for the broader park. If you look at Director Park, there's a whole bunch of fixed pieces and then all these loose things that kind of move around the fixed parts. So the idea of having something that's stable and something that's movable is really needs to be discussed more than just talking about, what's wrong with fixed or what's great about movable. You actually need both, I think, done in the right way. But now to move that to the question about, okay, well, if people can control their own destiny in terms of personal space in a park, controlling their own destiny in a more district or regional scale becomes another problem. And one of the things that one of my partners suggested was that the Jersey Shore should end up forbidding any more construction, and that after the next couple of hurricanes, they should just allow people to have movable dwellings that when the hurricane's coming, they just get in the trailer and drive it inland or something. The notion that communities could actually end up with less fixed assets and less fixed facilities, and that you would actually have these little pods in the different communities that explain to people how to be more resilient and how to bend, not break, how to move, and how to take certain things, leave certain things in place that can take the beating, and then have other things that come and go with in a more temporal way. I don't know if that answers the question. I have no idea how to, well, I mean, stopping bad mining and deforestation, those are things that you're either going to try and do it or you're not. And I don't know how that correlates to the other question. Maybe I missed the connection.
Yeah, well, we could just split them back apart into two separate questions if that's easier. The first question mentioned communities who were at risk of gentrification. So just another force.
Oh,
that's out
okay.
of
Let's
their
talk about
control,
gentrification.
Yeah.
Well, the gentrification one is an interesting one. We took that on head on in the Los Angeles project because we thought the first thing that'll happen is if the real estate community finds there's going to be this nice big park here and it gets funded, then they will start gobbling up houses and driving out the people that we're trying to help, who will then be homeless or have lost their neighborhood, their community will be shattered. So we built into the project a series of things that have to do with affordable housing, with homelessness, with affordable housing, and with stabilization of communities through various devices having to do with basically funding, helping with other things. And so we now have the city of Los Angeles has an enormous problem. You know, I don't know how many, I can't remember how many 100,000 people that need housing. It's a very large number. And so the question was that because some homeless people are living in the river now, we have to, if you're going to deal with the river, then you have to provide housing for those homeless. And then if you're going to stop gentrification, then you have to protect the neighborhoods from speculative development to some degree. And you have to build affordable housing that helps anchor it. So we believe they are absolutely linked, that park development at the scale we're proposing can only be done and justified if you have a housing program to go with it. And the county has bought that. They agree and they're working on it. And to our surprise, they're really quite ambitious about it. And I advised the caller to actually check on some of the programs that now are actually taking place, because it's really pretty positive, I think. I mean, it's like the tip of an iceberg given the whole region, but anyway.
Thanks. So we're pretty close to time. So maybe I'll just, I was trying to figure out a strategy, but I'll just keep on asking in order and see how far.
I'll try to be shorter.
we get on this one. But if you have a lot to say, then please we'll end where we end. There's someone asks, I'm curious your perspective on accountability and how it is dispersed among all of these different layers of community. So I think interpret that as you will, but the idea of accountability in the landscape and in open society seems like an interesting thing to ponder.
Oh, it's so difficult. Well, we should all be accountable. Let's start with that. No one should say, "Oh, it's not my fault. He did it. I didn't do it," or I was just following orders. That we know that's the road to hell. No, I think the design. One of the interesting things I find is that the landscape architect is usually the only person in the room who is the advocate for natural systems. There are engineers, there are lawyers, there are planners, there are politicians, there are architects, there are all sorts of other people, but you are the person who represents the natural world. But you also are the person, the landscape architect is accountable for the relationship between the environment and what it does to a person or to a family or to an individual. And so you have to always remember that your client isn't necessarily the person who's paying the bill. who's in front of you. You have to deal with them. It's like when I was did some corporate work years ago. One of the things was, you'd go in and make the presentation to the president and some board members or something like that. But the people you were really worrying about was the women and men in the company at lunch. Could they go outside and be in a place where they weren't being overseen by their supervisors? Did they have a place, who was I doing it for? I was really doing it for the people who spent their waking lives there, not some guy in a golf course or is going off to a board meeting in downtown somewhere. So you always remember the end user. That's where the real accountability begins, I think. And then you have to find a way to advocate for it without being preachy or without alienating the people who may have more power, but you don't think have vision. And you're in the education business all the time. You're always in the education business, trying to show people things without hitting them over the head with it, sort of leading them to make them think they thought of it. That's the biggest problem. And if you're disagreeing with them, you have to say, well, I see how you could think that. That's actually not a stupid idea, but I actually don't agree with it. And I'll tell you why. You have to find ways, because accountability really has to do with not undermining your own ethics and your own beliefs. And if you are like that, then other people around you tend to pick up their game. If you don't do it in a way that is smug or something like that. I hope that helps. I mean, it's the mayor is accountable when the police chief makes a mistake, but the police chief didn't go out and do the stupid thing the guy on the street did. Well, who's accountable? The policeman who did the wrong thing to a black person is accountable, but then so is his supervisor, and so is the commissioner, and so is the mayor. They all are. And so your whole organization, the newest, greenest person you just hired from school, and the oldest partner in the firm are all accountable for what happens on a project, I think.
Well,
you have to pay attention.
If you're up for it, we can close on a kind of feel like this is I'm going to give you a question that's heavy and hopefully doesn't overburden you in the last 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll give an answer.
But you mentioned it kind of ties into what you were just talking about. This person asks, in a time of a second wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, how do you think landscape architects should address mitigating racist landscapes to be reimagined for peace and justice, or perhaps trauma? Also, do you feel landscape architects are the best people to resolve this environmental justice within landscapes and memory?
Several thoughts. The first one is, W.H. Auden once said, poetry does nothing, it makes nothing happen. And landscape, you cannot make anyone do or not do something. Well, you can discourage behavior through negative design, but you can't make people be happy and you can't make people behave. But you can produce a space that's dangerous, or you can produce a space that is actually safer. You can produce a space that no one knows what the hell is going on in there. And so, bad people, good people, whoever goes in, you don't know. Or you could produce spaces where people going by see what's going on and it's okay. But they're welcome and open to anyone. And so I don't think landscape architects really can affect behavior that much, more than because of we cannot change social behavior, but and create norms. We can make places that work well for people who come prepared to be together in a creative way. And I think I really don't believe, I purposely talked about class distinctions having to do more with financial resources and with physical abilities in different ages and that sort of thing, rather than talk about ethnicities and about different cultural groups, because they're flexible and they keep changing, and we have these intractable problems that have gone on for centuries, and the only way to change them is for each one of us to just behave differently. It's not going to happen with a better bench, you know. I don't think. And I don't think that the places I've designed are neither black nor white. They're not they're not Anglo, they're just places. And I haven't seen anybody who didn't like being there, you know, if they could get there. But it's access quite often. And it's having enough amplitude so people can be together without being on top of each other, making each other nervous. So I think there's a certain generosity of proportion and scale that is required to have the social mix that we would like and that we believe in. There's a generosity that is needed.
I'm a big fan of that word, so I don't mind ending it there.
Okay.
Generosity. And I really want to thank you for being here. And
well, you're welcome.
When I heard you say that you were working on this lecture right up until the final hour and thought it might go long, I was happy to hear that, because I knew we were something.
Well, I kind of
really
rushed a few bits and stumbled over a few bits because I thought it was a bit overstuffed. But you know, it's a big topic, and yet the principles are not that hard, I don't think. You know? It's all the detail. It's the working it out is the hard part, and that's why we have a life to do it. Right?
Okay, well,
thank you.
Thank you once again.
You're welcome.
I hope that we can host you in person soon.
Yeah, well,
and
I'm delighted. I didn't even know. I just thought this was a talk. I didn't know it was an award. So thank you, Penn State.
Well, maybe that's on me.
Faculty and students. No, that's great.
Mail you the medal.
yeah, that's right.
I think we have one left. There was a department meeting where there's a crisis of.
You haven't melted them all down to
you might get to the last one.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Alec, and thank you to the other faculty and all the students and all the people at Penn State. I appreciate it. I wish I had come up there to Happy Valley, but it's okay. Another time.
Well, we'll have you anytime.